meeting, we will have a special focus on South Africa's results in this index, which covers the whole continent. We are going to use some slides and just to help us along, given all the numbers. First of all, happy International Women's Month. So International Women's Day was March 8th, and we have claimed the whole month. So please continue to celebrate. I have framed the index partly in a common concept used by economists around development in Africa. And one of the big hopes is that Africa will have the largest proportion globally of young workers in the years to come. And this is one estimate from the World Bank. By the year 2100, Africa's young workers will increase by 2.1 billion. And the rest of the world combined will be less than that at 2 billion. So this is what economists call the demographic dividend. And the assumption is that this large workforce will translate into growth in the continent. And the one big policy recommendation made by the more economistic thinkers is to governments to invest in health and education. Next slide, please. I argue that without investment in the care economy, those investments in health and education will not materialize into stronger and healthier young workforce. So let's begin with a little definition of the care economy. Demand for care is the need for care. And this is throughout the life cycle, starting from the womb. So maternity is the first movement of care. The supply is, of course, the labor power providing the care. And what we see linking demand and supply of care is legislation, policy, financing, and regulation at the bottom there. Next slide. Here is the Freetown scale, which Federica mentioned in the introduction briefly. It shows the amount of care needed in the world's major regions, units of unpaid care carried by the caregiving population in the various world regions. We see, of course, Africa is the highest at almost 3 units of care per caregiver. We have a world average, which is also quite high, and North America is also very high. So it means that there is a great deal of need for care in Africa, and this, of course, extends from childhood into old age and everything in between. Next slide. Let's look at a few figures for particular countries in Africa. This is the comparison of paid work performed by males and paid work performed by females versus the housework and family care provided by males and females. And what we see there is nothing surprising, except maybe the gap. So women and girls are providing the vast majority of housework and family care. And this is a difference of about 18 times. So girls and women providing 8 times more of this unpaid care than boys and men in Egypt. Here we have some figures for South Africa. It's more like a doubling for women and girls in terms of unpaid household work and care. And the next slide is Senegal, where the difference is about 3 times. Of course, the more time that is spent on unpaid care, the less time there is to go into the market to get a job and provide goods and services for women who can then earn a wage. Next slide, please. So the argument in the Africa Care Economy Index is that a socialized public sector response is crucial to reverse the normalized unequal distribution of care work in Africa. We assume this distribution, we don't question it, and we take this labor for granted. The only way to turn it around is through the public sector in a socialized model. Next frame, thank you. This will improve the well-being of women and girls as per the Africa Feminist Charter. And as we enter another global recession, I argue that this is the package of public investment around which to advocate from a feminist perspective. We know that we have the arguments of austerity. We must keep on countering those with the need for public spending, and this is the package of public spending that is crucial. Next frame. Let's look at the supply of care labor in Africa. What we know is that it is under severe pressure. Here's one example from the WHO, World Health Organization, Africa. Women in Africa are more likely to die of communicable diseases, maternal and perinatal conditions, as well as nutritional deficiencies. 30%, another example, 30% of women globally are anemic, and at least half live in Africa. So the current care economy is based on unpaid female labor, and this is not sustainable. Next frame. So the Africa Care Economy Index is a tool to advocate and demand accountability around these questions. I will summarize the index for you, beginning with the fact that it is divided into 10 metrics or 10 measures. Every country in the continent is measured against these 10 categories for a total of 30 points. For each metric, I give a definition of need, which is either Africa-wide or sub-regional within the continent. Of course, what we need is much more specific definition of need on a national and maybe even subnational basis. That is the work of the future, near future, I'm hoping. Then I measure the social recognition and state support for each of these categories of care. And that is in the form of legislation, policy, public financing, and the regulation of private provision. So this is varying per category, depending on which data is most available. There are different weightings per metric or per category. The weightings range between 1.5 points and 4 points as per the importance, which is defined in the index as per the proportion of the population affected and the relevance of the category in African contexts. Thank you. Let's have a definition of socialized care. It must be publicly financed and publicly provided. It must be universal. That means for everybody, regardless of income level, it must be nonprofit, and it must be financed relative to population need. Where possible in the index, I have indicated the reason why nonprofit is more effective. So let's begin with the first category, or the first metric. Paid maternity and parental leave. This arguably is the most basic measure of recognition and respect for care. How do we care for women carrying children? The need, well, Africa has near double the average birth rate in the world at 4.7 births on average per woman. The measure then is legislated paid maternity leave, and points are allocated for countries based on whether there is basic, which is maternity leave only for mothers, and then the top points are for parental leave, which is a non-gendered policy, allowing any of the parents to take the leave. The results in this category are the best for the continent. 53 out of 54 countries have legislated maternity leave. The range is between 8 to 16 weeks, but none of them have parental leave. And so this is, of course, another sign of the gendered notion of care in the continent. We assume it is women and girls who do this work. But the big caveat is that 39 countries exclude large proportions of women from maternity leave, including self-employed women, domestic workers, agricultural workers, casual workers, women who work in family businesses, artisans, migrant workers, and of course women producing food on the land who may not work for anybody. What are the results for South Africa? South Africa has one of the more generous leaves in the continent of 16 weeks. It includes domestic workers, it includes trainees, seasonal workers, migrants, but only at 30 to 66% of salary. So right at the time when you need more money to provide for more people in the family, and we know that women are the main ones providing basics to the family, women are left with just 66% of salary while on leave. I will get into the other details later. Please ask me the question on what South African maternity leave includes. Next frame, thank you. Socialized childcare, 4 points for this. So maternity is 4 points, same with socialized childcare. The need, well, the child dependency ratio by sub-region in the continent is very high. So that means there are a lot of children. There are fewer people who can give the care. The measure that we use for this metric is legislated public childcare, and failing that, legislated regulation of privately provided childcare. If the system is fully socialized, then the country will get 4 points. If it's partially socialized, partial points, and so on for regulation. Okay, let's keep the question for a little bit later. The results. In the continent, only Algeria has socialized childcare, but it's partial. 4 countries out of 54 have legislated regulation of private childcare centers. 6 countries have guidelines or draft policies. All of this is ECD and younger. Answer your question. In South Africa, what we have is that early childhood development centers of 6 children or more must register with the provincial government in question. Only eThekwini has bylaws on the regulation of private childcare. Socialized care for the elderly. So given that we have such a large proportion of young people in African populations, there are fewer elderly than in the rest of the world. But we still need to think about care for the elderly. For one reason, for one thing, just because we have a purported respect for elders in African cultures. The measure then is legislated care programs and homes for the elderly, legislated regulation of privately provided care for the elderly. If a country has fully socialized care for the elderly, they get the 3 points, and partial points otherwise. What are the results? Socialized care for the elderly is non-existent in the continent. Not a single country has it. Legislated regulation of private care homes exists in 3 countries. South Africa is one of them. Algeria and Mauritius are the others. And we can have the next slide. If we look at the ratio of elderly per 100 working age persons in the continent, we can see that North Africa and Southern Africa are edging towards some pretty big proportions by 2050. Already they have the highest in the continent. I argue in the index that we need to start thinking about this from now in Africa, because the longer we wait, the longer we lose caregivers to the rest of the world where the proportions of elderly are higher. We already know this. African caregivers of the various range of skills are working elsewhere in the world. What does that mean for the elderly in the continent? Next slide, please. 4th measure is socialized care for people living with disabilities. The need, we don't even have very precise numbers for the continent, but the estimations are between 10 and 40% of African populations are living with a disability. 10 to 15% of these are school-aged children. And when you read the index, there is a story at the very beginning, a true story, which really brings this point home. Please have a look at that. The measure is legislated public socialized care programs for people living with disabilities. Failing that, legislated regulation of private care. You see the points there, 3 points for fully socialized. Results, not a single country in the continent with socialized legislated public disability care. 1 country has legislated regulation of private care, and 3 countries have disability care policies. Now, policies are not legislation, so it's a pretty weak indication, but I do give partial points. Number 5, the 5th metric, next slide, socialized health. We know that there are high levels of illness in the continent and that there is heavy reliance on public health care by the majority in African countries. In 2001, we won't talk a lot about this, but during the last major pandemic to hit the continent, HIV/AIDS, African governments in the African Union agreed at the Abuja Declaration on HIV/AIDS to spend a minimum of 15% of government social spending on healthcare. So this is a category where we have numbers to rely on. The criteria is an average of 15% or more of government health expenditure as a proportion of general government expenditure. You get 4 points or nothing here. And let's see the next slide. Again, not a single country in the continent has lived up to this commitment made at the African Union. The average spending between 2002 and 2019, the latest data available, has been between 11 and 14% for 5 countries, including South Africa. The rest below 11%. That's 48 countries. Next slide. Here's a graph of South African government health spending over the same general government expenditure. Again, below 15% from the beginning of this time range. Next slide, please. Metric 6 is socialized food production. The need is there in Africa because female labor dominates the provision of local food supply. Of course, this varies between countries, ranging from 20 to 80% of food provided by women through subsistence agriculture, livestock raising, and so on. Also food processing. The measure, again, we have some spending data on agriculture, and that is the proxy that I use. The African Union member countries made a commitment to a minimum of 10% of government expenditure on agriculture. This was back in 2003, the Maputo Declaration, and recommitted to in Malabo in 2014. The criteria then is this commitment, average of 10% or more on agriculture for the years where I could get data, 1940 to 2014. Next slide. Again, very few countries are living up to this commitment. South Africa is not one of them. Most countries in the continent are spending less than 10% on agriculture. Next slide. COVID care, 3 points. So this became particularly relevant during COVID, which is when I started to work on this index. What is COVID care? It's paid time off work, additional care for the elderly and other vulnerable populations during the pandemic. The measure is legislation and policies. I had a lot of help because the UNDP and UN Women collaborated on a tracker to understand the response globally of governments around COVID-19. The results are, first of all, globally, only 180 care measures around the world. Imagine during a pandemic size of this one. That's 6% of the total COVID-related measures. So we know what governments did. They gave income support and maybe some extra injection to healthcare, pharmaceuticals, but on care, next to nothing. Within Africa, it was 6 states that offered 14 different COVID care measures. The criteria for these 3 points is non-gendered labor market measures. It means both men and women get, for example, paid time off to care for people affected by COVID. Assistance to all with special needs. Okay, so not only this population or that income level, but everybody who has special needs that are more pressing during the pandemic, financial assistance to all workers with pandemic-related care costs. These measures are important because we expect other pandemics and we see it unfolding already. Maybe it's epidemics. We have cholera and malaria. We had Ebola, a return of Ebola. There are many different examples, but there will be more pandemics and health issues. It's also relevant for climate crises, where, of course, the weight of care is again going to fall on women, the weight of resettlement, whatever is needed to save people from, for example, the cyclone in Malawi right now. Number 8, domestic worker protection. What is the need? The need is that almost 15% of paid workers in Africa are domestic workers. The measure is legislated workers' rights for domestic workers that are exactly the same as other employees. Why shouldn't they be? The criteria: protection equal to all other employees. I do give partial points for countries that don't have equal rights for domestic workers. What are the results? 11 countries with full protection. South Africa is one of them. 17 countries with partial protection. So the full labor code does not apply to domestic workers. In countries like Egypt and Algeria, there is explicit exclusion of domestic workers. And in those 2 countries, many of the domestic workers are minors. So we have totally unprotected girl children, mainly providing care in some countries. This is documented, right? We don't know what's happening in other countries in the continent that we rarely hear about. For example, Mauritius, Mauritania. Number 9, care grants or subsidies for care. This is a form of recognizing care in the absence of a fully or partially socialized care economy. That is why there are only 2 points for this measure. We tracked it through legislation around grants for caregivers and subsidies for paid care. The criteria: childcare for all parents, plus elder care covered for all. So again, non-gendered, and care for all living with disabilities, not only the low income or the middle income, and so on. The results: 3 grants covering partial care for limited populations in 2 countries in the continent. South Africa is one of those 2 countries. It has grants for caregivers of children living with disabilities. You see the amount there. And it has a care grant to those that are already on old age or war veterans or disability grants. And that is for a mere 440 rands per month. Next slide, thank you. Number 10, family care leave. This has only 1.5 points, given that most workers in the continent are not legally recognized as employees. Nevertheless, for those that are, this is a crucial way of recognizing care. And South Africa, amongst all countries of the continent, has the largest proportion of legal employees at 58% of workers. 5% is in the rest of Africa, so very, very small. The measure then is legislated family care leave. The criteria is a broad definition of family, given the way that we think about family in Africa. It is not just nuclear family. We are caring for all kinds of so-called extended family and maybe even others. Another part of the criteria, non-gendered, so not only for women. And paid. It's not only about time, but people need to not be losing their salary when they are providing for care. The results, 6 countries have narrow and minimal leave in the continent. 2 countries have narrow but more leave. And Sao Tome and Principe has the most remarkable leave program, 6 months of paid leave to parents, so not gendered, and between 60 to 79% of salary is given during that leave. South Africa has 3 paid days per year, only for illness of a child or death of an immediate family member. And this is particularly concerning, given that over close to 60% of workers in the continent, in South Africa, are actually legal employees and therefore could benefit from such legislation. So I have set the pass rate in this test at 18 out of 30. That means full points in the first 6 metrics as basic for pandemic and climate change readiness. So if countries had passed in those first 6 categories, we would have managed the COVID-19 pandemic far better. And we need that minimum to be ready for future climate and health disasters. You see those first 6 repeated there. Maternity, parental leave, and so on. Next slide, please. I think maybe my time is running up. Here are the results. Not a single African country passes the test. The top 6 countries don't even make half of the 18 out of 30 pass rate. And we see South Africa, the score is between 5 and 5.9 out of 30. Next slide. Here are the specific scores for South Africa per metric. So, socialized maternity parental leave, 1 out of 4. Please ask me questions about this in the discussion for more detail. Socialized childcare, 0.4 out of 4. Socialized care for the elderly, 0.75 out of 4. Socialized care for people living with disabilities, 0. Next slide. 0 for socialized healthcare, 0 for socialized food production, 0 for COVID care, 2.5 out of 2.5 for domestic worker protection, highest score for South Africa. Care grants and subsidies, 0.75 out of 2. Family care leave, 0.3 out of 1.5. Coming to a total of 5.7 out of 30. Reminder, the minimum pass is 18 out of 30. Lots of work to do. Next steps is in-depth country studies for policy proposals around the ensemble of care relevant to each country in the continent. And in the index, I specify questions to look into in terms of in-depth country studies. So the key research questions to begin. Thank you very much. Please keep in touch. And I look forward to the responses and the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Valiani. Very sad that we failed as a country. So I'll just try to say welcome to those people who just joined us now or just a couple of minutes later. We were talking about the Africa Care Economy Index, who Dr. Valiani is the author of. So during this discussion, she was unpacking, the undervaluing of care work across the continent, and that there has to be sort of like a rethinking of this work, and that there has to be a response in the public sector. So without taking any of your time, I'd like to open up the floor for another person who can respond to the argument. Julie.
Thank you so much, Salimah. Just personally, I am so appreciative of this index. I think it really does put care on the conceptual and ideological map. Hopefully on the political agenda is what we can hope. Just to start off to say that I think the text is incredibly accessible and provides a clear mapping of the care economy, which seems like a simple task, but I think oftentimes the care economy is synonymous with just healthcare. But I think the index expands that to also include food production, family care leave, as well as grants and subsidies, which make up quite a large portion of South Africa's care funds, which I think is really important. It also gives insights into the distinct challenges of the continent. We are facing a continent with a very vibrant informal economy, which is quite a specific issue of Africa and the global south in general. I think something else that it really does is, I think this is a huge positive, is that it gives guidance as to where to look in the continent, as opposed to, in terms of Algeria doing quite well in terms of childcare. I think it maps out examples and stories from the continent, which I think are really important sites of learning for the rest of the continent. And it just provides an incredible layout of various access points by which to, as you say, investigate care further. I just have three other very broad points, and I would be really keen to have them as discussion points. But the first is, of course, as we had discussed, I was really excited by your critique of a framework of Ubuntu. And I really appreciated your opening with this sort of disclaimer around Ubuntu being a very profound part of caregiving across the continent. But it is in many ways being adopted to sort of reinstate generational inequalities and gender inequalities. In South African policy, it's very much used in older persons, person's care. It's used in our foreign policy documents, and I think there is a very deep need to think how Ubuntu is being instrumentalized. I think that the Close and Fanzal have put forth this idea of Ubuntu do versus Ubuntu talk, and Ubuntu talk is it upholds ideas of a genderless idea of care, but when there is a lack of state intervention, it's very difficult to sort of enact care in a way that isn't fraught with discrimination and inequality and gender and class dimensions. Just to say, that is very commendable, saying that Ubuntu is a porous concept, because often I think that it's adopted without critical insights. So that was very exciting for me. And then just two other much larger points, actually, which I found to be very interesting, is I have a bit of curiosity around the use of this economistic thinking or the productivist discourse that is employed. So this idea that Africa has this demographic dividend, and if it can be harnessed, then we will have a flurry of economic development. And I suppose the issue that I take is that it kind of instrumentalizes care in a way that is only investing in future populations as workers. It kind of begs the question of what about those who are not relevant to the labor market? yeah, I think that, many feminists have problematized the concept of gender and smart economics, and I kind of wonder how care is being instrumentalized in the same ways. So as to say that if we invest in care, we will have a more docile, productive labor force, and that's why we should invest in care. And I think the idea is that there are many people who will fall on the exclusion or the peripheries of the labor economy, and that also require, high levels of care. I think, in South Africa, there is a very large growing population of older persons, and I think having a very productivist view kind of puts them on the peripheries. So that is just my one thought. And then the last one just pertains to, I suppose the idea of socializing care in a continent where so much of care is concentrated within the home. What are other ideas besides socializing care into this very public good? Might we support family caregiving, which I also think has issues around redefining gendered notions of care as well as generational notions of care. But perhaps to think, we can think creatively about the ways in which to support care in ways that don't necessarily reflect the Scandinavian state or the young. That I think are my 3 contributions. I'm happy to discuss further.
Well, thank you, Joy. I really appreciate your insights and reflecting on the index itself. And I really like the fact that you introduced the concept of Ubuntu, which I have a question for you, but later on. So, before moving to the final discussion, which is with Dr. Clovo, I'd like to say that anyone in the chat or anyone here was a question that they need to post, just write it down, and after Dr. Tachi does a discussion, we'll move on to Dr. Salimah so that she can answer the questions. So moving on to you.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to actually read this piece closely and offer my understanding of this case. So it's funny how we are seated here and discussing care work, and I'm actually doing some care work on my own. The baby fed, what did she eat, and all that stuff, and the father is doing field work and doing this thing. So it's really rings close to some of the experiences that we have to go through as women and girls that have to go through. So thank you for this. I was intrigued actually by a few points. It's great that you gave the more technical aspect of your report, but there is more that we can get from it, which is a bit less technical but very important as far as women and girls are concerned in Africa, especially on their welfare. So one of the important highlights for me was that the care economy is mostly unrecognized and ignored in Africa, and the care work itself is invisibilized. It's unevenly distributed, it's undervalued, and it's very normalized, the genderedness of it, that is. And Africa is not really committed to reducing this unfair burden of care work on women, and it's great that you go on to suggest ways in which that could be done, which some of them I just have a few questions, but it's fine. And then the why part of it for me, you gave a lot of reasons, technical reasons that you just gave now, but then you also highlighted on the issue of Ubuntu that I found very interesting, that this concept of Ubuntu is used to enforce patriarchy, especially around tech. And I also coupled it with the concept that we are running with now, that is Women's Month of Imbogoto. And like this is the same concept. It's a concept that works the same way as Ubuntu, especially this one now that it's very localized on women and it encourages the caring of care work unquestioningly and naturalize it. Like you're a woman, you have to carry this load. You don't have to question it. And
you're strong.
Yes, you're strong. So just take it, and you have to make sacrifices. That's part of womanhood. So I got very excited when you went on to cite nervous condition, which is a book that I'm reading for I don't know how many times. And I'm drawn particularly to what Titi says in this novel when she goes to the market, the protagonist, when she goes to the market to, sell her produce for her school fees, because the brother was the one that was given school fees and stuff and proper education. So she had to find ways of sending herself to school. So when she is there, she makes a very, to me, even the first time when I read it when I was young, I was like, okay, this is something, and it comes very strongly in what you are saying here. She said that women smelled of unhealthy reproductive odors when men gave off strong aromas of productive odor. So, and you comment on how women's care work is not, or even their work in terms of, you commented on agricultural produce, that their work is not really recognized. It's recorded that, okay, they produce 10% of export grain, for example, in Zimbabwe. But when you go further to look at what is unaccounted for, some of the produce that they make is to feed the family, and that is not really counted as part of the produce that they make for the big economic gains of the country and things like that. So I found that very, very exciting for me, and I always find myself getting carried away by these things. So, and also the fact that men, the male-dominated forms of work are the ones that are appreciated, while women's are undervalued and ridiculed, like unhealthy reproductive odors kind of stuff. So, and then, and you give a lot of statistics, which I found very interesting and very important in terms of even not people in the care work industry, but also for sociologists to really dig into, okay, these are the statistics, this is the real problem that we're facing. It's not like women or feminists making a fuss out of something that is natural and can be embraced. And then you go on to give us some guidelines on what is to be done. The first one for me was a socialized public sector response. And you highlighted two things under that. You say they should be building a culture of respect. And on that one, I would like you to at least elaborate further, because I didn't want to make assumptions on what that culture of respect is and what it should look like. And also you talking of redistributing care work. And the question for me was practically, how does that look? What are the steps that can be taken to get to a point where we redistribute the care work? And also you talk a lot about adequate financing of the care economy, which I think is a great contribution of this. And also culturally defined forms of care should be also, you emphasize on that. And I think it's very important when looking at this kind of thinking that women are naturally, born to take care of other people. And you also I think you commented on the care economy as an opportunity for job creation. Or I was just thinking of that, if the way you put it, it would be an opportunity more for job creation. And this work took me to the work that we have done here at Parental on taxation and state-society relations, and reading through how the issue of taxation and its link to gender equality and how VAT unfairly burdens women because they're the ones who have to go out and buy firewood and paraffin and food and all the care that is involved, while men focus on leisure and syntaxes and all those. So it was close to home when I got this reading. So and then you said the consequences, the socioeconomic underperformance, and to me that exacerbates the situation for women, and which is something that is real, and your paper points to that, and it should be maybe taken seriously in terms of policy formulations and stuff. So just to conclude, I found myself thinking along the lines of how this gendered care work, I think maybe for selfish reasons, contributes to violence against women in all its forms. Like, because to me it sounded like it's a slow violence when we talk of the pace of violence, the slow violence on women, and it's something maybe when we talk about violence we don't really talk about care work, but I think it's the violence.